French Indochina IN 19465 for the states of Indochina, North Vietnam Bac Bo, or Tonkin, Central Vietnam Trung Bo, or Annam, South Vietnam Nam Bo, or Cochin China, Cambodia and Laos, had been French colonies or protectorates since the 19th century. In the 1930s, communist-led risings in Tonkin and Annam had been bloodily suppressed, many insurgent leaders fleeing into China. In 1940 they returned to northeast Tonkin and began to build up their armed strength from almost nothing. They made a late and insignificant show of resistance to the Japanese, which nevertheless established their credentials with the American OSS and earned them some U.S. arms and training. Under the Vichy regime, the French garrison had to tolerate the installation of Japanese bases. In March 1945, the Japanese interned all French troops and officials, butchering those who resisted. The survivors fought their way out into nationalist China, and the Japanese turned over civil government to local elements, including the figurehead emperor of Annam, Bao Dai. The Japanese surrender in August 1945 was taken by nationalist Chinese troops in the north and a British Indian division in the south. Neither was able to interfere with a communist program of taking over grassroots-powered and Japanese weapons. It would be October 1945 before French troops returned to Saigon, and March 1946 before the first reached Hanoi. This priceless power vacuum allowed the Comintern veteran Ho Chi Minh to establish a strong revolutionary organization at first in Tonkin, and later throughout Vietnam. They presented themselves as Democrats seeking a peaceful end to colonial rule, and in Hanoi in September 1945 Ho declared the birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The Communists initially formed a common front, Viet Nam Doc Lap Down Minh Hoi, roughly League for Vietnamese Independence, with other nationalist groups. This gradually collapsed during 1945-47. The French persuaded some of the non-communist elements, e.g. the Cao Dai sect based around Tay Ninh, to come to terms. And though the communists kept the title Viet Minh, they ruthlessly eliminated all challengers for leadership. In parallel to their energetic political program, the VM, under the military leadership of Vo Nguyen Giap, rapidly built up large if sketchily trained forces equipped with Japanese and French weapons. Though the French reassumed power in the south after brief fighting, their return to Tonkin was delayed by a slow Chinese withdrawal until Ho's government was a fait accompli. At American prompting, the French were reluctantly forced to negotiate, but, still stinging from the humiliations of World War II, they were in no mood for compromise. Incidents between French and VM troops were inevitable, finally escalating into heavy fighting in Hanoi on the 19th of December. The negotiations collapsed, and the French opted for a military solution. With hindsight, it is easy to criticize their failure to appreciate that they faced a new form of revolutionary warfare, not merely arising by colonial malcontents and opportunistic bandits. But before Mao Zedong's stunning victory in China in 1949, no Western army recognized this phenomenon. By April 1947, the French had regained apparent control over the main towns and highways and parts of the coastal and delta ricelands. The VM, completely outgunned, had nevertheless succeeded in withdrawing their main force, the Chu Loop, deep into the refuge offered by the jungled hills of northeast Tonkin. This free zone of the Viet backed the provinces of Bac Ken, Cao Bang, Lang Son, Hajiang, Tien Quang and Tai Nguyen would be their heartland. Protected by its rugged terrain and close to the Chinese frontier, here they set up their camps, depots, hospitals, and factories. During the monsoon rains of spring-summer 1947, both sides paused to regroup. The battlefield Tonkin had rich, densely populated rice-growing lowlands forming a triangle around the delta of the Clear, Red and Black rivers. This French heartland of about 7,500 square miles held the capital Hanoi, the main port of Haiphong, and some 8 million people, about half the total population of Vietnam. Outside the delta lay the wild hills of the Viet Bac to the north, and to the west the Thai highlands, both heavily forested, hardly explored, and penetrated by only a few bad roads. Cochin China had the only other heavily cultivated and populated region, comprising the wetlands around the Mekong Delta. Annam is the narrow waist connecting the two. From Tonkin to southern Annam, the heavily wooded mountains of the Annamite chain form the spine of the country. These lie mostly along the Laotian border, but swell out to form the high plateau of the Central Highlands in southern Annam and northern Cochin China. All the highland regions were sparsely scattered with Montana tribal villages. These robust mountaineers had good reason for their historical hostility to all lowland Vietnamese, and many fought alongside the French. In the hills, roads navigable by motor vehicles were few, mechanized movement away from them impossible, and overhead cover limitless. In the rainy season, many dirt roads become impassable for months at a time. The lowland swamp jungle and reed-covered plains are cut into a maze by innumerable streams. Vietnam is, in short, guerrilla heaven. The climate is exhaustingly hot and humid for much of the year, though the Tonkinese winter is miserably cold. The southwest monsoon rains last from May to October. The northeast monsoon, from September to December, is typically very foggy, though morning fog can also shroud the hills at other seasons. This crash in French slang, spittle, severely hampered our operations, as the French relied heavily upon air transport for strategic mobility, and upon tactical air support for isolated units. The VM soon learned to exploit the weather. Outside major towns, the French had never occupied Vietnam in any meaningful sense. Metaphorically, their garrisons were small islands, and in the high country, remote islands in an uncharted ocean. Even in the crowded and relatively well-guarded deltas, the peaceful farmer could transform himself into an active guerrilla whenever he was not actually under the eyes and guns of French troops. And for most of the war, about 80% of the country hardly ever saw a Frenchman. In one vital sense, the battlefield extended beyond Vietnam's borders. Giap's greatest assets were his sanctuaries inside China's Guangxi province just over the Tonkin frontier, and the supplies and instructors provided there by Mao's regime after 1949. The cooperation enjoyed by the VM from small local communist groups in sleepy Laos and Cambodia was militarily negligible, but Giap's ability to maneuver inside Laos gave him a strategic advantage in forcing the French to divide still further. Their overstretched reserves were militarily futile, while providing the VM with targets of opportunity for capturing a few rifles or a precious radio. Outside the Delta, even larger posts, such as those facing the Chinese frontier, were usually more of a liability than an asset. Typically held by a company or two of bored, jungle-happy European or North African infantry with one or two mortars or old artillery pieces, they were usually able to defend themselves against all but the most determined assaults. But their control of the surrounding countryside was illusory. The enemy could infiltrate through the wilderness between them without difficulty, and it took a major effort simply to keep open the roads upon which they depended for supplies. Meanwhile, Giap built up his main force in the Viet Bac, in his secondary base area south of the Delta, then Hoa, Angin and Ha Tinh provinces, and, from 1949, inside China. Time was always on his side. He denied the French any opportunity to meet his main force face to face, and it was repeatedly demonstrated that they lacked the resources to hunt it down and destroy it in its sanctuaries. This period represented both the guerrilla and protracted phases of Mao's revolutionary timetable. Mao Zedong's establishment in October 1949 of the People's Republic of China completely transformed the war. In November, Ho Chi Minh announced general mobilization of the population of VM-controlled areas, and in January-February 1950 his government was recognized by Red China, the USSR and the other communist states. Moving to the mobile warfare phase, Giap finally unleashed his main force in October 1950, winning a stunning victory en route Colonial. This gained him the whole of Tonkin east of the Red River, enough booty to equip a division, huge prestige, and the priceless advantage of unhindered movement across the Chinese border thereafter. The loss of northeast Tonkin briefly paralyzed the French command, but morale was improved by the arrival of Jean de Lattre de Tassigny as CNC and political governor. De Lattre sought to create a secure base of fire by fortifying the Delta, carrying out major security operations within its defenses, and building up the Armée Nationale Vietnamine, initially to take over security within the Delta and later, ideally, to provide all static garrisons. Neither objective was achieved. Most French units were thus to be freed for a strong airborne and motorized reserve to carry the battle to the enemy. Overconfident after his victory, Giap prematurely launched the first of three major assaults on the Delta defenses in January 1951, with the slogan Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi for Tet the Chinese New Year in mid-February. He was bloodily defeated at Viet, Mau Cay and the Day River, largely by de Lattre's energetic deployment of his new mobile groups and tactical air power. The events of spring 1951 seemed to promise the dawn of the sort of war the French could win. However, the shaken Giap abandoned his premature general offensive for a war of concealed movement and stealthy concentration of major units against selected targets. When in November 1951 de Lattre threw a major force west out of the delta along RC6 and the Black River to reoccupy Ho Binh, he was simply offering Giap a chance to repeat October 1950, an isolated position at the end of long, vulnerable lines of communication. Initial French success soon turned into a battle of attrition, which proved that outside the delta prolonged operations dependent upon road and river communications could not be sustained. De Lattre, dying of cancer, was replaced in December by Gen. Raoul Salin, who withdrew from Ho Binh in February 1952. While so many units had been committed, their enemy activity elsewhere had escalated alarmingly. In October 1950, Giap moved decisively to the mobile warfare phase with thrusts southeastwards into the Thai highlands and Laos. In the Maoist handbook, this phase calls for maneuver and divisional strength, diverting government forces over long distances, writing down their assets and dissipating their reserves, while rehearsing the revolutionary formations for the final offensive. In spring 1953, Giap again divided the overstretched French forces by committing even larger assets to this new front. French attempts to divert him by launching painfully assembled and necessarily brief ground and airborne task forces against his base areas achieved only temporary results. The strength and confidence of the Chuk Loop grew steadily, while the diversion of French units to Laos allowed VM activity to increase throughout Vietnam, including inside the delta itself. The map was relentlessly turning red. One encouraging episode was the establishment by airlift of a strong garrison at Nha San in the Thai highlands. This fought off major attacks in November 1952, and was resupplied, reinforced, and eventually evacuated by air. To some, this success seemed to offer a way to lure Giap between the anvil of a strongly fortified airhead far from his secure bases, and the hammer of French artillery, armor and air power. This concept, and the wish to counter the continuing threat to Laos, led Salin's replacement Gen. Henry Navarre to garrison the distant valley of Dien Bien Phu in winter 1953-54 with what amounted to a weakly supported infantry division, wholly dependent on a 200-mile air bridge to the delta airfields. The 10,000-man garrison was doomed by the choice of battlefield, by French weakness in airlift capacity and logistics, and by the VM's unsuspected skill in the concealed use of their field and anti-aircraft artillery. Fundamentally, however, the fatal mistake was the French High Command's stubborn underestimation of Giap's ability not just to assemble and maneuver a 50,000-man field army, but to keep it supplied throughout weeks of positional fighting, over 500 miles of rudimentary roads, despite French command of the sky. It was this astonishing logistic effort which tipped the balance. The desperate fighting in the monsoon rains of March-May 1954 took on the character of a World War I battle of attrition. But from the day that Giap's guns closed Dien Bien Phu's airstrip on the 27th of March, the outcome was inevitable. The shock of the camp's fall on the 7th of May, with the loss of many of the CFEO's finest units, was rapidly followed by major Viet Minh successes in the Delta and the Central Highlands. In Paris, the Mendes France government took power with a mandate to negotiate a quick ceasefire at almost any cost. The Viet Minh leaders, conscious of their huge casualties at Dien Bien Phu, perhaps 8,000 dead and 12,000 wounded, and apprehensive of direct U.S. intervention, were willing to compromise. A ceasefire and partition of Vietnam at the 17th parallel were agreed in Geneva on the 21st of July 1954. French Union Force Resource French Far East Expeditionary Corps CFEO had a strength of about 115,000 in 1947. From 1951 to 1954 it was roughly constant as follows: land forces, 175,000, 54,000 French, 18,000 West Africans, 30,000 North Africans, 20,000 Foreign Legion, 53,000 Vietnamese under French command, naval, 5,000, Air Force, 10,000, local auxiliaries, about 55,000. By spring 1953, the Vietnamese National Army (NV) claimed an additional 150,000 plus men, giving France a theoretical total strength of some 445,000. But this force was almost entirely static and defensive. Only a quarter had tactical mobility, and a tenth strategic mobility. In 1953, the available maneuver forces amounted to 7 brigade-sized groups mobiles, 8 airborne battalions, and some riverine units. Of the daunting difficulties faced by the CFIO, the worst was an overall lack of the political will and military resources necessary to prosecute the war successfully. France in 1945 was a traumatized nation. Since 1940 she had been defeated, divided, occupied, pillaged, fought over and finally liberated by foreign armies. Much of her economy and administration were in tatters. Frenchmen were divided by bitter enmities, and liberation had been followed by a bloody settling of accounts. Competing interests, including a strong communist party, were squabbling over the shape of her post-war political institutions. Not surprisingly, the Fourth Republic born of their quarrels was a sickly child. General de Gaulle, leader of the wartime Free French forces, withdrew in disgust from public life in 1946, and during the course of the Indochina War France would have no fewer than 19 governments, none with a clear mandate to fight it aggressively. During part of the war the Communists were partners in coalition government. Their hostility to it was expressed both in parliamentary obstruction of the means to fight it, and even through the trades unions by encouraging the widespread sabotage of equipment destined for Far East. But the unpopularity of this dirty colonial war spread beyond the communists. France as a whole was so ambiguous about its morality and utility that at various times, for instance, citations for medals awarded for gallantry in Indochina were ordered omitted from the official gaze. And it was felt necessary to announce that blood donations solicited from the public would not be used for transfusion of Indochina casualties. The effect on military morale can be imagined. The shortage of manpower was also serious. The reduced post-war army was committed primarily to the French zone of occupied Germany, facing the Soviets. The CFIO was a mixture of French and foreign troops from widely different backgrounds. Some were ex-Gaullist Free French, some colonial troops who had joined the Allies only in 1943. Some former resistance fighters, some young men recruited for the 1944-45 campaigns, some former Axis and other nationals serving in the Foreign Legion, and many were native troops from France's colonies. Some proved to be magnificent combat soldiers, with a high esprit de corps and energetic leaders. Others were less impressive. Hostility to the war was reflected in a legal prohibition on sending French conscripts to the Far East, which aggravated the manpower problem. And this pressure led in turn to the inadequate training of replacement drafts. The only nominally all-French units in Indochina were made up of career volunteers, and from about 1949 even these were forced to recruit locally to keep up their strength. The large number of African and Asian units requiring French cadres put a constant strain on the already inadequate supply of able junior officers and NCOs, among whom, by the very nature of the fighting, casualties were consistently high. Native troops required a particularly mature, paternalistic type of leadership. Sometimes they got it. The records are full of remarkable feats performed by Frenchmen commanding isolated one-company posts, or leading commandos of Montagnard auxiliaries. But the potential of other units was wasted by neglect and crude racism, particularly at junior NCO level. Many non-European troops were poorly trained. French defeats sapped their morale as, inevitably, did the fact that the enemy were fellow non-Europeans defying the French. To these generalizations there were many impressive exceptions, but the overall problems were real. To the manpower shortage was added a chronic lack of every kind of equipment. In the early years the CFIO presented a motley spectacle, clothed, equipped and armed with every kind of US, British, French, even captured Japanese materiel. Infantry support weapons were in dangerously short supply, and small arms in many different calibers, e.g. 7.5 mm, 7.62 mm, 7.65 mm, 8 mm, .30 and .45 US, 9 mm, and .303 British made. A single telling anecdote illustrates this. A former sergeant in the 1st Foreign Parachute Battalion, a crack intervention unit which might expect a high priority, recalled that in March 1949 his 10-man section relied on their 7.5 mm FM 24-29 light machine gun. They had only one nearly useless 7.65 mm MAS .38 machine pistol. 4 others having broken down in recent weeks, has had all 4 of the folding but 7.5 mm MAS .36 CR-39 rifles issued. The rest of the section had been given Berthier M1907-15 rifles in 8mm, but without even their 3-round ammo clips, so that only single cartridges could be loaded. In 1950 his section received excellent German MP.4 SMGs, but with British 9mm ammunition and unreliable combination resulting in jams and accidental discharges. Their support weapons were 7.62mm Rifle M1931A Fortress machine guns, stripped out of Maginot-Line casemates and rigged on tripods, which were poorly adapted for infantry use. One difficulty was the USA's hostility to this colonial war before 1949, when the French faced U.S. sanctions if, for instance, they proposed sending to Vietnam U.S.-supplied aircraft. The flow of aid increased dramatically after Mao's victory in China in 1949 and the communist invasion of South Korea in 1950, to the point where the USA was bearing a significant part of the total cost of the war, but the relationship remained tense. America's price was serious progress towards Vietnamese independence and a viable Vietnamese national army, for which many U.S. weapons were explicitly intended. The French were ambiguous about this program. Given the doubtful combat value of end units, they were often issued obsolete equipment while the new U.S. supplies were diverted to French units. Main French combat on its base prevents a comprehensive list. Unit evolution was complex. In particular, we omit combat units which were active only pre-December 1946 or post-May 1954, and all service units. Before 1951 artillery, from both Metropolitan and Colonial regiments, was almost entirely static. In that year batteries and 3 battery groups began to be attached to mobile groups. For most of the war the static artillery totaled between 250 and 300 guns of assorted types, and the towed mobile artillery about the same number of US 105mm HM to howitzers. The normal tour in Indochina lasted about 2 years. Within the infantry, that uniquely French institution, the Bataillon de Marche BM, allowed the creation of sometimes short-lived task groups assembled from elements of one or more parent units. From 1951 de Lattre's energetic program saw much local recruitment into nominally French units. Typically this involved Vietnamese forming at least one battalion of multi-battalion regiments, and at least one company within nominally French battalions. Even after the complete battalions were transferred to the Vietnamese National Army in 1952-53, the locally recruited element within nominally French units would remain important, sometimes exceeding 50%. Most infantry battalions of all categories had 3 rifle companies and a single headquarters and support company, and in most cases the fire support elements were weak, usually with only pairs of 30 cal MGs, 81mm and or 60mm mortars, and our CLS 57mm or 75mm recoilless rifles. Independent mortar companies, including some with heavy 120mm tubes, were formed from 1950 to improve fire support assets. Where a whole regiment is listed here, this usually indicates 3 battalions, v.g. below. 21E Rick signifies I, 2 and 3 21E Rick. These were disbanded in October-December 1952 with transfer of local elements to A and V units, the remainder forming a single Bataillon de Marche, BM to 1er Rick. Metropolitan Infantry French Volunteers. Main units: 1er Bataillon d'Infanterie Leger d'Afrique 1er Bila, 3 Bila, BM 35e Regiment d'Infanterie, BM 43 Eri, BM 49 Eri, BM 110 Eri, BM 151 Eri. Colonial infantry. These form the bulk of the infantry, mainly dispersed in static posts. Mixed composition, largely French, some African volunteers, later heavy local recruitment. Main units: BM 1er Regiment d'Infanterie Coloniale, 1er BM 2 Rick, 5E Rick, BM 5E Rick, 6E Rick, 1er and 2E BM 11E Rick, 21 ERIC, BM 21E Rick, 23 ERIC, BM 23 Rick, 43 ERIC, BM 43 Rick, 110 Foreign Legion Infantry. Foreign volunteers, later with local recruitment. Main units: 2 Regiment Étranger d'Infanterie, 3 URI, 5 URI, 13 Demi Brigade, 13 DBLE. Airborne troops. French and foreign volunteers with local recruitment. The Paris made their reputation in Indochina as crack troops with aggressively minded officers, and virtually the only units which could achieve strategic surprise. They were committed to an exhausting pace of operations. They took part in both major offensive drops and in near-suicide missions to rescue isolated units, and they fought as elite infantry in every kind of offensive and defensive operation. They achieved many local successes, but suffered very high casualties. More than one battalion was completely wiped out, reformed, and annihilated a second time before the ceasefire. The typical parachute infantry battalion in 1950-54 consisted of an HQ and support company and 4 rifle companies, of which at first 1, and later 2 were Vietnamese. The final establishment was 446 Europeans and 406 Vietnamese. The HQ and support company had pairs of 81mm mortars, 30 cal MGs and 57mm RCLS, replaced in some units after 1951 by 75mm RCLS. Company HQ sections had to 60mm mortars, or 1 plus 1.30 cal machine gun. Battalions served in Indochina under a complex series of designations and redesignations. Essentially they were either Metropolitan, Colonial, or Foreign Legion. Main units: Metropolitan 1er Battalion Parachutist D Chalk 1er BPC, 1947-48. I 1er Regiment D Chasseurs Parachutists, 1947-49, 2 1er RCP, 1953-54, 3 1er RCP, 1947-48. 10e Battalion Parachutist D Chasseurs EPI 10e BPCP, 1900. Colonial 1948. Demi Brigade Parachutist SAS redesignated to EDBCCP Demi Brigade Colonial ED Commandos Parachutists. Odd formation, 1947-51. Successor battalions were designated 1er 2e, 3e, 5e, 6e, 7e and 80 battalions Colonial D Commandos Parachutists BCCP. And from March 1951 redesignated battalions D Parachutists Colonial BPC. In 1953 the East BPC was retitled D Chalk. Foreign Legion 1er Battalion Étranger D Parachutists BEP. 2e BEP, 1949-1954. Non-European Infantry. Algerian and Tunisian Rifles North African Volunteers. Main units: 1er 2e, 3 BM 1er Regiment D Tirailleurs Algerians, 1er 2e, 3 BM 2e RTA 1er 2e, 3 BM 3 RTA, BM 6 RTA, BM 4e, 5e BM 7 RTA, 2 1e, 2 3e, 2 5e, 27e BTA, 1er 2e, 3 BM 4 RTT. Moroccan Rifles North African Volunteers. Main units: 1er 2e, 3 BM 1er Regiment D Tirailleurs Marocains, 1er 3e, 4e BM 2 RTM BM, I2 3 RTM, 1er 2e, 3 BM 4 RTM, I2 3, 4 BM 5 RTM 2 3, and BM 6 RTM, BM 7 RTM, BM 8 RTM. Moroccan Goumiers North African Volunteer Irregulars, often with local auxiliaries attached for Regi tasks, Tabor's battalions each of 3 Goums companies plus HQ. E.g., during January 1951-November 1952 Group Mobile to Intonkin included 17e Tabor 14 East, 18e and 22 East Goums with attached local 501 and 282 ECS MIS, and Lotion 65 ECLSM. Main units: 1er 2e, 3e, 5e, 8e, 9e, 10e, 11e, 17e Tabors. Senegalese and African Rifles West and Central African Volunteers with large French cadre. Main units: 23 Regiment D Marche D Tirailleurs Senegalais to BNS, 13e, and 26e 32e BMTS Incle, 1er and 3 BM d'Afrique Occidentale Francaise. 2 BM de Central F Armored Cavalry French Volunteers with local recruitment. Units were deployed in widely dispersed squadrons for route security, convoy escort, etc. No rigid organization was possible, and most incorporated large Vietnamese motorized infantry elements. In 1951 De Latre organized the first Tussauds Groupements Blindies SGB, each with 1 tank squadron of 4 platoons, each of 3 tanks and 5 A1 Stuarts, later M20 for Chaffies and to half-tracks, plus 1 or 2 half-track and lorried infantry companies. Groups d'escadrons de reconnaissance had 1 tank squadron, 1 Recce squadron of 3 platoons each of 5 M8 armored cars, and 1 platoon of 3 M8 HMC 75mm SP howitzers, plus local infantry. Main units, 1 RRGT, D Chasseurs et Chevaux formed SGB2, AGR, 6 Group d'escadrons amphibies Geo Tonkin, 4 RGT, D Dragons ports Cochinchina, Annam, 5 RGT, D Cuirassiers Royal Pologne Cochinchina, Annam, RGT, D Infanterie Coloniale de Morocco despite title, an armored unit. By 1952-53 it had 2 M20 for tank and 3 Recce squadrons, and 5 infantry companies, formed GB3 and GR2 Tonkin and Annam. 1 RGT. Étranger de Cavalerie fought as infantry in Cochinchina and Annam 1947, then with mixture of armored cars, trucks, jeeps, M5A1 tanks, 1948. Pioneered use of M29C Crab and LVT Alligator in amphibious combat role. By 1953 had 18 squadrons, including 5 2 Squadron Geo at Terrain and Haiphong, to east, 5 and 6 RGTs. Despas Americans, 8 RGT. Despas Algerians, mixed equipment and employment. EG6 CRSM fought as infantry 1949-52, later with 1 M24 and 4 half-track squadrons, formed GB4 Annam. EDRS fought as infantry 1949-51, then formed GB1 Tonkin. RGT. Blind Colonial d'Extreme Orient, formed 1950 with M for Shermans and M36B to tank destroyers, based Tonkin to counter any direct Red Chinese incursion. Groups mobile self-sufficient motorized brigades formed from winter 1950-51 on the model of World War II U.S. combat commands. These typically consisted of 3 lorried infantry battalions with elements of towed artillery, light armor and/or tanks, engineer, signals, and medical troops totaling 3,000 to 3,500 men. In 1953 7 GMs were available, but at various dates a total of 17 were raised from French, Foreign Legion, African, Vietnamese and Montagnard units GMs 1 to 11 Incal, 14, 21, 42, 51, 100. Valuable for rapid reinforcement of threatened sectors in the delta, and the hills and swamps. Narrow roads and sabotaged bridges slowed them down and left them vulnerable to major ambushes. Representative composition, Group Mobile to Tonkin, January 1951 July 1952 Call, Clement, later Call, De Castries. HQ element from 5 East Ray, 27 EBTA, 1 RBM, 1 RRTM, 213 ADBLE. For GP, Reret Artillerie Coloniale de Maroc 3 TIS. Of 4 by 105 mm, 11 and 17 Tabors Americans, Armored Car Platoon, Tank Platoon, Local Auxiliaries. In February 1950 the Legion Battalion was replaced by both the 2 EBM, 1 ERRTM and 28 East BMTS. 4 Vori CM was replaced by Vori CM. Group Mobile 100 Central Highlands, December 1953 July 1954 Call, Bear. HQ Co. 100. IN2 RGT, Decory, BM43 RIC, 410 Iraq, 3 ESCA 5 RGT. Cuirassiers. Amphibious units formed for operations in swamps and waterways, e.g. the Million-Acre Plain of Reeds west of Saigon, the Tonkin Delta, and coastal Annam. By 1950 for 2 groupments amphibies, mostly from the Legions 1 or REC, each had 3 squadrons of M29C, 3 of LVT-4, plus 6 LVTA-4 with 75mm howitzer turrets. Local irregulars throughout the war. French units formed their own irregular commandos for counter-guerrilla work. In 1951-50 for a belated but successful program, the Mixed Airborne Commando Group GCMA disrupted VM operations in the hills of Tonkin. These behind-the-lines guerrillas played the VM at their own game. They established safe areas from which to raid, sabotage and ambush the enemy, hit his supply lines, act as tripwires and scouts for isolated French units, and generally hamper the VM effort, eventually totaling some 20,000, under the overall direction of CDT. Trinquer. Most were recruited from various Montagnard tribes, lightly armed, and led by handfuls of very courageous and resourceful French junior ranks. Living for many months far beyond reach of any help, young NCOs led bands of up to battalion strength with great success. Tragically, the speed of the French collapse in 1950 frustrated many of these heroic soldiers and McQuizered so deep in enemy territory that they had no hope of reaching safety. There were heartbreaking reports of their being mercilessly hunted down by the Viet Minh for many months after the ceasefire. Armée Nationale Vietnamese ANV following Dien, de Latra's invigorating arrival in 1951, some effort was made to extract military advantage from the political fiction of the French Union, an association embracing France and ostensibly self-governing Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos. Generally, formed units of Cambodian and Laotian troops were not highly regarded due to their national culture of pacifist Buddhism, though many individuals were enlisted and proved anything but pacifists. A national army for the Sovereign Republic of Vietnam had been languidly discussed in the late 1940s. Now conscription was introduced to build up the ANV, and local recruitment to e.g. Colonial and Legion infantry was also formalized. Conscription broadened the educational base, U.S. weapons were provided and occasionally reached the troops, training schools and officers' academies were set up, and in 1950 Dien, Nguyen Van Hinh, a distinguished French Air Force veteran of World War II, was named Chief of Staff. In winter 1952-53, Vietnamese battalions previously attached for on-the-job training to Colonial and Legion regiments formed the nuclei of new ANV battalions VG, 2 Dong 62, 63, 64 and 65 were formed from, respectively, 1 or N2 EBM 11E RIC, AN2 22 RIC, NTD 68, 75 and 76 were formed from 413 EDBLE, 45 E-Ray, and V3 E-Ray. These, and the Vietnamese Paris, were the best ANV troops, often with battle-hardened Vietnamese, ethnic Cambodian or tribal NCOs. The airborne battalions 1 or 3, 5E and 7E BPVN popularly, but wounds earned a good reputation fighting alongside the French para units which formed them between July 1951 and late 1953. By spring 1950 for the ANV claimed a paper strength of 145 battalion-size units in service or under training, but their actual contribution never approached what that figure suggests. Of the nominal total, 45 were new light battalions to Dong Kinh Quan, with a high scale of Thompson SMGs in place of rifles, and 60mm mortars instead of 81mm. Much was expected of the TDKs, which were unwisely publicized in advance as commando standard units for harrying the VM in the countryside. The quality of their personnel, equipment and training fell far short of this claim, and VM regulars made a particular point of smashing them as soon as the first were committed to combat. Howard R. Simpson, whose duties with the U.S. Embassy in Saigon in 1953-54 included evaluating ANV units in the field, recalls that quality varied widely, reflecting battalion leadership. One which fought at Nas NTD 56 had a very competent noun commander. Others had political appointees who left all the work to their French advisors. The wealthier class often bribed their way out of serving, and the ranks included to many press gang villagers given only slipshod training. Static garrisons kept their families with them, and even units serving with mobile groups tended to acquire a domestic tail if they stayed in one place for long. Intelligence operations. Many French intelligence agencies and local interest groups simultaneously pursued their own expedient agendas, sometimes cooperating, sometimes conflicting. This shadow world owed as much to straightforward gangsterism, profiteering, currency rackets, drug smuggling, and local political and ethnic turf wars as it did to military intelligence. A lot of people made a lot of money, a lot of people were murdered, and a lot of arms and supplies found their way to the Viet Minh. However, the more straightforward military intelligence tasks, e.g. aerial photo analysis and radio intercepts, did achieve some solid successes. Naval forces. The Marine Nationale's small forces earned an excellent reputation, both the Aeronavale Hellcat, Dauntless, Helldiver, and briefly Corsair crews flying off the carriers Dixmude, Romanches, and Lafayette, and briefly, in May 1954, Boisbelot, and the coastal and riverine units Dinosautsa divisions Navals Dassault. These were formed in 1947-52 with ex-US landing craft, at first simply for riverine security and resupply, and insertion of embarked local infantry commandos, later light assault companies. CLA letters during river and coastal operations. Some craft were soon armored and fitted with cannon turrets for direct fire support, and the DNA letters played a valuable part in many combined arms operations. Dynasats 1, 3, 5, and later 12 operated in Tonkin 2, 4, 6, and later 8 and 10 in Cochin China and Annam. Typical composition of a DNA was 1 LSD, LCT or LSSL command and fire support ship, 6 to 10 LCMIS, some being armored monitors with gun turrets, some with 81mm mortars, 3 LCVPs, and 3 to 5 LCA letters. Air forces, given their great reliance on air transport and tactical support, the French were always short of pilots and aircraft. Aircrew were thinly stretched, often flying an exhausting program of missions over terrain from which they could not hope for rescue if they survived a crash landing or parachute jump. From 1951 VM anti-aircraft fire became increasingly common and accurate. Many types succeeded one another during the war. Initially, Axis wartime designs included Junkers Ju-50 to transports, Fieseler Fi-156 Stork spotter liaison planes, and even a few Japanese Ki-43 Oscar fighters. Later Army de l'Air equipment included Spitfire X, P-63 King Cobras, Grumman Hellcats, and Bearcats. The A-26 Invader was the main bomber type, and increased numbers of the C-47 Dakota the main transport from 1951. By 1953-50 for the fleet included A-75 XC-47s 1954, X-100, 16 XC-119 packets U.S. volunteer crews, a few Beaver and Bristol freighter transports, 48 XA-6 Invaders, 8 XBB-4Y privateer 4-engine bombers, helicopters so few were available that they were limited to the most urgent medical evacuations. Even by March 1950 for the available fleet totaled just 32, divided between Saigon and Hanoi. See commentary plate H1. The Viet Minh recruitment and organization. The essential strength of the Viet Minh was its widespread support among the civilian population, and its agents' penetration of the colonial bureaucracy at many levels. The VM infrastructure, much of it in place before 1947, provided taxes, rations, extra crops for sale, intelligence information, porters for the ever-growing logistic network, and recruits. Although the subsistence farmers who made up most of the population no doubt prayed to be left in peace by both sides, Vietnam had a 1,000-year tradition of resistance to invaders. The Communists were never squeamish in their methods of enforcing collaboration among the reluctant, particularly in the South, where the VM chief Nguyen Binh used outright terror tactics. The French managed to persuade some nationalist groups to make a separate peace, e.g. the Catholic Cao Dai militia, the Hoa Hao sect, and the Bin Zion, a former bandit gang who ended up policing Saigon Cholan. Nevertheless, Mao's lessons on the vital importance of cultivating real popular support were well learned. The VM targeted the moneylenders and landlords who made the peasants' life wretched. In the villages, indoctrination was accompanied by help in the fields and a popular literacy program. Requisitions were not burdensome, and women were not abused. The sufferings caused by corrupt Vietnamese officials and by heavy-handed French military operations, together with the increasing prestige and power of the Viet Minh, ensured a continuous flow of genuine volunteers for Giap's forces. For many Vietnamese, service as porters was all that was required, though this meant sharing all the hardships and dangers of long marches over rough terrain, under constant threat of air attack. When a VM maneuver unit was passing through their territory, the local organizers ensured that enough coolies turned out to carry the supplies and heavy equipment for about a week on their backs, or wheeling strengthened bicycles, before turning over their loads to the next relay. It is estimated that a regular division needed about 50,000 porters to maintain it away from its base area. The total number of men and women who died in this service from sickness, accident, and enemy action can never be known. The basic popular forces were raised in each village, and to categories. The Dan Quan organized non-military helpers of both sexes and all ages to carry messages, act as porters, and provide eyes and ears. The Dan Quan Du Kich were part-time guerrillas, men aged from 18 to 45 years who, though very weakly armed, could slip out of their villages by night to carry out local road sabotage, and even occasional attacks on very soft targets. Popular forces carefully gathered anything the French left lying around, e.g. unexploded shells and bombs were salvaged and planted as landmines. Men who proved their worth were selected for the next level up, the regional forces. Regional units were typically based, part-time, in hideouts in difficult terrain, and most of the attacks on posts and convoys during the guerrilla phase of the war fell to them. Their activities were coordinated from above, however, and they might also be thrown into all-out battle to support or mask the operations of main force units nearby. In the early years, these second-line troops were scattered in local sections Trung Doi, platoons Dai Doi, companies Dai Doi or commandos Lo Doi of varying military value. Titles were confusing and transient, and allegiance to larger regional regiments Kai Doi was administrative rather than tactical. The command network was based on the integrated zones Lien Ku into which the country was divided from 1948. For instance, in Cochin, China in 1946-47 one band active around Godo Hai and Trang Bang northwest of Saigon was variously termed Dai 50 to Ko.No 52, subordinate to Kai Doi 57 or GT No 57, or Bo Doi Lu Down 1 Mobile Commando No 1, but in fact it was more widely known as Bo Doi Hong Tho Commando Hong Tho after its charismatic leader. In December 1946 it was listed as having 3 sections, 3 LMGs, 4 SMGs and 25 rifles. In 1948-49 many smaller units were amalgamated into tactical battalions to Udon, usually fairly well armed and trained, and these into nominal regiments Trung Don, though often of single battalion strength. Selected men were sent on leadership courses, officers from the Chukluk were sent south to see some action with the more frequently engaged regional units, and the best units were in time redesignated, in place, as full-time regulars to Luke. A scattering of independent regular regiments and battalions thus steadily appeared in VM-dominated areas around the country. For instance, in Cochin, China in December 1949 Bo Doi 303 represented the fighting strength of regular mobile RGT, Zone 7, and comprised Guz 2719 the Old Commando Hong Tho, 2720, 2721 and 2723. After shakedown training north of Cape St. Jacques it became active around Viet Minh. In August 1950 Nguyen Ben, the VM commander in South Vietnam, reorganized his forces into 4 regular and regional regiments. One was based in Zone 7, Trung Don Chiluk Dong Nai regular RGT. Dong Nai consisting of BNs, 301 heavy weapons, 302, 303 as above and 300 for infantry, and 305 HQ and services. By this time, incidentally, Hong Tho himself had been transferred and punished for a drunken rampage. The dashing guerrilla leader had been unable to adapt to a staff post in this new regular army. Main force formations most regular main force units were formed in the Viet back end, after 1949, in Chinese camps at Wenshan, Longzhou, Jingxi and Shumao. They received the best available equipment, their supply lines into Tonkin being serviced by a truck fleet which rose to approximately 600 by late 1953. They were thoroughly trained by experienced Chinese instructors, 400 of whom also crossed into Tonkin in July 1950. Courageous and well-led, they formed the Army of Maneuver under the direct authority of Giap and his lieutenants. The first formation was Regimental Group 308 in August 1949, consisting of RGTs 308, 92 and 102. By the end of the year 308 capital Div, plus RGTs 174 and 209, had been equipped and trained in China. The regular divisions had an establishment of 3 infantry regiments and 1 artillery battalion, the regiments, of 4 infantry battalions, and 1 heavy weapons element typically, 4 by 75 mm guns, 4 by 120 mm mortars. The support elements grew slowly, as most guns and heavy mortars were held back for the parallel formation of a heavy artillery division numbered 351. Divisional strength began at around 12,000 men, and later settled at around 10,000. The 800-strong battalions had 20 machine guns, 8 by 82 mm mortars, 3 by 75 mm or CLS, and a number of bazookas in addition to small arms. Divisions formed by the end of 1951 were 300 for Div, RGTs. 9, 57, 66, plus 345 RD. Dien, 308 Div, RGTs. .36, 88, 102, 3. RGT.1 for 1, 165, 209, plus 150, 316 DEV. RGT's .98, 174, 176, plus 812 HVY.WPNS. RGT's .48, 52, 64. Late that year, a 325 DEV was formed administratively, at least from RGTs 18, 95 and 101 in the Thuathine area of Annam. Additional independent RGTs in Tonkin were 148 Highlands, 42, 46 and 50 Delta, 238 and 246 Defense of Viet Bac in Annam, 96, 108 and 803, and in Cochin, China, RGT. Dong Nai Bien's .301 to 304, RGT. Dong Thap Moi BNS 307, 309 and 311, in the Plain of Reeds, RGT. 300 for my area, RGT. 950 for operations against Saigon, RGT. Kulong BNs, 308, 310 and 312, Trevin area, and RGT. Tedu BNS 402, 404, 406. By 1953, the units of 351 heavy DEV included 151 M, but 237 heavy WP 82 mm mortars, 45 RT, RGT, 105 mm howitzers, 675 RT, RGT, 75 mm pack howitzers and 120 mm mortars, and 367 ARGT. 37 mm A guns, 50 cal machine guns. Sources differ over VM strengths, but at the beginning of 1947 they totaled about 50,000 regulars and 30,000 to 50,000 regional and popular forces. In summer 1950, some 25,000 regionals were upgraded to regulars, giving GIAP about 60 regular battalions for their first campaign. Later estimates quoted are, in 1951 110,000 regulars, plus 200,000 to 250,000 regional and popular forces. Summer 1952, 110,000 regulars, 75,000 regional and 120,000 popular forces. Spring 1953, 125,000 regulars, 75,000 regional and 250,000 popular forces. Weapons in 1945, about 30,000 Japanese rifles and 2,000 LMGs went mostly to the regional and popular forces. The regulars received French weapons formerly seized by the Japanese. More Japanese weapons were later supplied by the Red Chinese and the USSR, the latter, from stocks captured in Manchuria. By the end of 1945, the total VM arsenal was about 60,000 rifles, 3,000 LMGs, a few French and Japanese mortars, and perhaps half a dozen field guns. They also had large quantities of grenades, which were issued more freely than rifles to the popular militia. Apart from Japanese and French weapons, there was a wide range of others from various sources. American and Czech rifles and LMGs were sold by the Chinese nationalists or handed over later by Red China, as was U.S. equipment captured in Korea, including bazookas, and larger numbers of 75 mm or CLS than the CFO had. The first returning French units mostly had U.S. and British World War II types, which later found their way to local auxiliaries, and hence into the hands of the Viet Minh, who also benefited at second hand from the U.S. aid program to France from 1950 onwards. They also purchased and smuggled in arms through Thailand and the Philippines, partly funded by the sale of rice and opium smuggled out of VM-held areas. The victory on RC for and abandonment of Lang Son in autumn 1950 brought them about 8,000 French rifles, 1,200 SMGs, 950 MGs, 125 mortars, and 13 guns. During 1951, the Chinese provided some 18,000 rifles, 1,200 MGs, 150 to 200 mortars, and 50 Czech RCLS. During 1952, another 40,000 rifles, 4,000 SMGs, 450 mortars, 120 RCLS, and the first major deliveries of AN field guns. Main force regulars are said to have received enough SMGs to equip one infantryman and 3 non-French types included the Soviet PPSH for 1 Chinese Type 50, the PPSH for 3 Thompson and Sten. Light machine guns French FM, 24-29s, Czech Z-27s, Russian DPs, and a few US bars and British Sprens were also plentiful, perhaps on a scale of 1 per 10-man section. Tactical effectiveness Viet Minh regulars, and many regional units, were first class. It is clear that they had successfully made the mental transition from guerrillas to soldiers. Neutral journalists who managed to spend time with regionals were impressed by their discipline and preparedness. Throughout the VM based on the images provided, here is the extracted text. Text from image 1 told that around 10,000. The 800-strong battalions had 20 machine guns, 8 by 82 mm mortars, 3 by 75 mm or CLS, and a number of bazookas in addition to small arms. Divisions formed by the end of 1951 were 300 for Div. RGT 9, 57, 66, plus 345 RD. Dien, 308 Div. RGTs .36, 88, 102, 3. RGT 1 for 1, 165, 209, plus 150, 316 Div. RGTs .98, 174, 176, plus 812 HVY.WPNS. RGTs .48, 52, 64. Late that year a 325 Div. was formed administratively at least from RGTs 18, 95 and 101 in the Thuathin area of Annam. Additional independent RGTs in Tonkin were 148 Highlands, 42, 46 and 50 Delta, 238 and 246 Defense of Viet Bac in Annam, 96, 108 and 803, and in Cochin China, RGT. Dong Nai BNs .301 to 304, RGT. Dong Thap Moi BNS 307, 309 and 311, in the Plain of Reeds, RGT. 300 from my area, RGT. 950 for operations against Saigon, RGT. Kulong BNs, 308, 310 and 312, Trevin area, and RGT. Tedu BNS 402, 404, 406. By 1953 the units of 351 Heavy Div included 151 Ng, Licht, 237 Heavy WP, 82 mm mortars, 45 RD, RGT, 105 mm howitzers, 675 RD, RGT, 75 mm pack howitzers and 120 mm mortars, and 367 ARGT. 37 mm A guns, 50 cal machine guns. Sources differ over VM strengths, but at the beginning of 1947 they totaled about 50,000 regulars and 30,000 to 50,000 regional and popular forces. In summer 1950 some 25,000 regionals were upgraded to regulars, giving GIAP about 60 regular battalions for their first campaign. Later estimates quoted are, in 1951 110,000 regulars, plus 200,000 to 250,000 regional and popular forces, summer 1952. 110,000 regulars, 75,000 regional and 120,000 popular forces, spring 1953 125,000 regulars, 75,000 regional and 250,000 popular forces. Text from image to weapons in 1945 about 30,000 Japanese rifles and 2,000 LMGs went mostly to the regional and popular forces. The regulars received French weapons formerly seized by the Japanese. More Japanese weapons were later supplied by the Red Chinese and the USSR, the latter, from stocks captured in Manchuria. By the end of 1945 the total VM arsenal was about 60,000 rifles, 3,000 LMGs, a few French and Japanese mortars, and perhaps half a dozen field guns. They also had large quantities of grenades which were issued more freely than rifles to the popular militia. Apart from Japanese and French weapons there was a wide range of others from various sources. American and Czech rifles and LMGs were sold by the Chinese nationalists or handed over later by Red China, as was U.S. equipment captured in Korea including bazookas, and larger numbers of 75 mm or CLS than the CFO had. The first returning French units mostly had US and British World War II types, which later found their way to local auxiliaries. and hence into the hands of the Viet Minh, who also benefited at second hand from the U.S. aid program to France from 1950 onwards. They also purchased and smuggled in arms through Thailand and the Philippines, partly funded by the sale of rice and opium smuggled out of VM-held areas. The victory on Orsi for and abandonment of Lang Son in autumn 1950 brought them about 8,000 French rifles, 1,200 SMGs, 950 MGs, 125 mortars, and 13 guns. During 1951, the Chinese provided some 18,000 rifles, 1,200 MGs, 150 to 200 mortars, and 50 Czech RCLS. During 1952, another 40,000 rifles, 4,000 SMGs, 450 mortars, 120 RCLS, and the first major deliveries of AN field guns. Main force regulars are said to have received enough SMGs to equip one infantryman and 3 non-French types included the Soviet PPSH for 1 Chinese Type 50, the PPSH for 3, Thompson and Sten, light machine guns French FM, 24-29s, Czech Z-27s, Russian DPs, and a few US bars and British Sprens were also plentiful, perhaps on a scale of 1 per 10-man section. Tactical effectiveness Viet Minh regulars, and many regional units, were first class. It is clear that they had successfully made the mental transition from guerrillas to soldiers. Neutral journalists who managed to spend time with regionals were impressed by their discipline and preparedness. Throughout the VM, attention to tactical detail was excellent. Both in camp and on the march, great emphasis was laid on camouflage, night movement, dispersal and reassembly in face of the enemy, and endurance with the simplest rations and minimal medical care and comforts. The VM were skilled at concealed cross-country movement in the worst terrain, carrying all essentials with them. This gave them a significant advantage over motorized French troops, whose more complex logistic needs kept them tied to the inadequate and vulnerable road network. Generally, only the best French paratroop units could match their cross-country speed in the jungle hills, and that for only limited periods. It was rare for French aircraft to inflict much loss on regular units on the march, though their supply lines suffered much worse, e.g. in 1954. During the huge effort to supply the Dien Bien Phu siege army 500 miles from the Viet back bases, French officers remarked on the VM's excellent fieldcraft. They were masters of the ambush, on any scale. Their heavy weapons and artillery were dug in and camouflaged so well, often in the caves which honeycombed the crags of the high country, that they could be served without revealing themselves to aircraft or counterfire. Regional forces, obliged to remain more static in nominally French-occupied areas, were brilliant at evasion and concealment, digging complex underground hideouts and stores. Attacks on French posts were thoroughly prepared after careful reconnaissance, often using ground plan models. French units were identified before objectives were selected, and the VM were uncannily good at feeling out weak points. Diversionary attacks were often launched, typically by regional units, to confuse any supporting effort by nearby French artillery, and ambushes were set along approach roads to block relief columns. They brought their mortars, or CLS, and guns into action fast and accurately, against well-chosen and plotted targets, e.g. command and radio bunkers, and heavy weapon positions. French soldiers found it unnerving that these conventional military skills were combined with a willingness to take horrific casualties in human wave assaults. Once infantry were committed to an attack, their courage was sacrificial. Assaults, led by volunteers carrying satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes, were pressed home again and again over the corpse-choked wire. Although incessant political indoctrination was couched in turgid communist jargon, memoirs make clear that unit and personal loyalties carried more real weight for individuals. The commissars preached the inevitability of victory, yet Giapa, far more than the French high command, stressed the stupidity of underestimating the enemy. The Baudois was only human, and morale must have suffered badly in the face of the huge casualties from support weapons, artillery, and airdrop napalm suffered during the positional battles of 1951-54. Yet although there was a steady trickle of defections, even including some field officers and commissars, there were few known instances of regular commanders or units collapsing. During the worst weeks at Dien Bien Phu, VM reports did mention subjective tendencies. Commissars speak for hesitancy among units already shattered in murderous fighting. Viet Minh commanders followed one doctrine which Frenchmen found almost shocking. Reinforcements were never risked to rescue hard-pressed units, which were routinely abandoned to their fate. This icy insistence that each unit do or die often foiled French efforts to divert Vietnam advances. This was in direct contrast to the European attitude. French units were repeatedly cut up in ambushes laid along the few and predictable roads, or sacrificed in desperate jungle airdrops, while trying to rescue comrades in peril. Viet Minh intelligence was nearly always excellent. The French employed local personnel in many capacities, and their thorough infiltration by the VM made day-to-day secrecy impossible. Agents reported any French troop movements. Major operations were obvious well in advance from the assembly of vehicles and materiel. Even if exact drop zones were not usually discovered, airborne operations were signaled in advance by the assembly at Hanoi Jalam, Hanoi Bok Mai or Saigon at Tan Son Hut of the overstretched transport fleet. Another giveaway was the pressing into service of, and subsequent formation practiced by, civilian DC-3 South. The VM's treatment of French casualties was more often utterly callous than sadistic. Some were even repatriated at times, to make a propaganda point, although others were executed, for the same reason. Wounded were usually either shot out of hand as they were stripped of anything useful, or simply left to die horribly where they lay. French soldiers forced to abandon their seriously wounded by the impossibility of carrying stretchers far through the jungle hills routinely gave morphine overdoses. There were occasional instances of the French being told to collect a few of their wounded from prearranged places. The reason was presumably psychological. The VM were showing themselves confident enough to be merciful, and when collection took place on the battlefield amid the buried French dead, the effect on morale was depressing. If walking wounded prisoners were taken from the field, they usually died from complete neglect of their wounds. And an average of about 60% of all CFEO prisoners died during prolonged marches and years in prison camps. 90% of Vietnamese personnel. The VM followed a vigorous program of brainwashing their prisoners, a man's rations depending on his cooperation. Some photos of prisoners exchanged in summer 1954 recall those of Belsen survivors. Chronology of Major Operations 1947. Oc Gen, Val I launched Op. Lee against the Viet back bases, 10 BNS. By road from Lang Son for by river, and to Para BNS. Dropped on Bac Ken, Giep was unprepared for airborne attack, and the Paris only just missed capturing Ho Chi Minh. But the VM quickly regrouped. The Lang Son column was held up by incessant ambushes. The rivers proved less navigable than believed, and the amphibious troops had to march further overland than planned. The French inflicted much greater losses than they suffered, but the VM disengaged successfully, as they would so often in the future. Novop. Sincher attempted to trap VM withdrawing southwards an area between Tien Quang, Vitry, Tai Nguyen, and Cho Chuai and Lur CP, Lur Chok, DBSAS, 5 East and 6 CRTM. I3 Ray. The French claimed 793 VM killed, 168 captured, for 108 French dead and 277 wounded. The only indisputable success was the rout of VM units between the Red and Black Rivers by the French-led Time Montagnard battalions. 1948 Valais was replaced by Gen. Blazot. No major offensives were launched by either side. Guerrilla pressure continued to grow. The VM strengthened their infrastructure, communications, and central control of regional units, and built up the regulars. July successful defense of Phu Tong Ho post on RC.3, Tonkin Highlands, by Decos, of I3 Ray against an usually determined attack. 1949 Sepgen, Carpentier replaced Blazot, delegating operations in Tonkin to the locally experienced Gen. Alexandre. Alexandre concentrated on sweeps inside the delta to squeeze Giap's supply lines. The Chukluk's food situation became so serious that Giap even considered a potentially disastrous major offensive against the delta to lift the threat of famine. A communist victory in China marked the turning point of the war. By the end of 1949, Giap could begin to depend on supplies from China, which had trained and equipped the first 1.5 VM regular divisions. The VM began probing the scattered French posts in the frontier region, where road movements were already under constant attack. 1950 Sept French plans to withdraw from Cao Bang and other isolated posts along RC, for were forestalled 16th when Giap threw 5 battalions with artillery against Don K. This fell 18th after desperate resistance by Decos of 2-3 Ray. Altc while Lepage moved up from Lang Son to that K with 3,500 men Lur and 1 Lur TM, Lur BM VDR TM, and parachuted Lur BEP. Oct ordered to retake Dong K first. Lepage's advance was blocked by strong VM forces. Alti, Col, Charton abandoned Cao Bang third and marched to meet him 1,500 men -3-3 Ray, 3 DM, irregulars. Both columns were repeatedly blocked and ambushed, taking heavy casualties. They were forced to leave RC for 4 tracks through the wooded hills to the west, where between 15 and 30 VM battalions harried them almost to destruction. Both commands had been terribly reduced before they linked late on the 7th. Half of 3 BCCP jumped into that K to hold it against their rival 8th. Lepage and Charton dispersed their survivors in small parties to try to infiltrate back to that K. Some 300 reached the post 9th. Cap. Jean-Pierre led in 29 survivors of Lur BEP 10th, and later that day that K was abandoned. The Paris of 3 BCCP were wiped out during rearguard actions 10-14th. Of some 6,000 casualties, 4,800 were listed dead or missing. Lang Son was abandoned in panic 17th-18th, its large stores intact. 1951 Gen Giap mounted a premature assault 13th by 308 and 312 divs. On the Delta defenses at Viet Minh, the logistics required 2 million porter days. Initial human wave attacks were successful, but were checked when de Latre took personal command. Quickly assembling reinforcements GM1, GM2, GM3, he unleashed constant air attacks, including the first use of napalm. Giap's casualties by the 17th were 6,000 to 9,000 killed, 500 prisoners, and nearly 6,000 wounded. March major VM attacks were launched around Mao K by 308, 312 and 316 divs, threatening Haiphong port. After brief but desperate fighting, these were repulsed, Mao K itself being held by Senegalese 30 BMTS. Though partisans and RICM armored cars, relieved by 6 BPC and DNA-1, with gunfire support from warships on the Dabok River. May-June while 312 DIV. Mannerved north of the Delta Giap sent in a third assault across the Day River north and south of Nam Dinh, rice-growing country which the VM needed, inhabited by independent Catholics whom they wished to dominate. Essentially diversionary attacks, in heavy monsoon rain, were mounted by 300 for DIV. Towards Fulai and 308 DIV. Towards Ninh Binh, the main thrust was by 320 DIV. Towards Phat Dien 1 RGT, had infiltrated towards Tai Binh to cooperate with local IND.RGT, 42 in attacking the French rear. 304 and 308 divs. Achieved initial success, and on the 30th of May 320 DIV, crossed the Day. De Latre quickly assembled 3 groups mobiles, 4 artillery groups, an armored group, and the Paris of 7 BPC. The VM made only slow progress across the paddy fields, decimated by French aircraft and artillery, and Catholic militia proved a match for the 2 regiments behind French lines. Dinosaurs cut Giap's lines across the Day, and by the 6th of June the French had the initiative. Between the 10th and 18th of June Giap was forced to withdraw, at a cost of 9,000 dead and 1,000 captured. Sept-October Giap moved RGT 1 for 1 and 209, 312 DIV, against India Low, the main post in the Thai hills between the Red and Black rivers, his stepping stone for invading Laos. The Vietnamese garrison held out until reinforced by a BPC 3 Oct. When Tibet was also dropped for October, they mounted aggressive sorties with air support. This victory bred the dangerous illusion that if isolated garrisons could hold off initial assaults, they could always be successfully reinforced by paratroops, and that the VM would not press home assaults in the face of heavy firepower. Nov de Latre moved to recapture Ho Binh, capital of the loyal Muong tribes and an important VM road junction 25 miles west of the Delta. An initial airdrop by 1 RBP Op. Hulip, the 15th of November seized the town without difficulty. 6 GM is pushed along RC. 6 to link up, while riverine units from Vitry forced the loop of the Black River. Giap refused confrontation, falling back into the jungle hills and patiently preparing for a battle of attrition along both land and river links. French posts along the Black River Nap Da Chong, Notre Dame Rock, Tivu were heavily attacked by 312 DIV. 1950 to Dien, Ceylon replaced the dying de Latre, as Giap tightened the stranglehold of 304, 308 and 312 divs. Meanwhile, units of 316 and 320 infiltrated the delta from north and south to disrupt French rear lines. The last Black River convoy was turned back with heavy loss on the 12th, and the West Bank was abandoned. Relentless pressure now fell on RC. 6, e.g. posts at Zomphio, Kem, Juanmai. 5 battalions were surrounded at the end of a narrow corridor held, with great difficulty, by another 4. A major push to reopen and clear the road took 12 battalions with heavy artillery and air support 12 full days, the 18th to the 29th of January. Ceylon ordered withdrawal. Feebly prodding units back down RC. 6 to the Delta involved a costly running battle, the 22nd to the 24th of February. This campaign saw increasingly sophisticated VM infantry tactics, effective use of cleverly concealed artillery, and of artillery. Giap sent most of 308, 312 and 316 divs southwest into the Thai highlands towards Laos. Anguillo quickly fell. Other garrisons fell back towards the Black River line, and 6 EBPC were dropped at Tula to buy them time, at great cost. Other isolated garrisons withdrew on Nau San, where a fortified camp was established by airlift. No, for once Giap underestimated French strength. When 308 Div began the assault on Nau San 23rd, it was faced by 3 BPC, 1 RN to East Bep, 3-3 and 3-5 East Ray, to Trailer and to Vietnamese battalions, plus artillery, wired in behind 3,500 mines. Although strongpoints changed hands in heavy fighting until the 2nd of December, Giap never looked like overrunning the camp, and suffered several thousand casualties in the attempt. The garrison was gradually reduced, finally withdrawing in August 1953. Ceylon mounted up, Lorraine, an ambitious thrust by 30,000 men up RC, 2 into the Viet back to destroy bases and lure regular divisions back from the Thai highlands. He committed for groups mobiles, to Sue's groupments blinds, and a Dinosaur on the Clear River, and 2,350 paratroopers 3 East BPC, IRN 2 EBEP jumped successfully over Fudon the 9th of November. But Giap, confident that French logistics could not long sustain this 100-mile thrust up a narrow corridor, refused to fall back from the Laotian border, leaving just 2 regular regiments and regional units to harass Lorraine. The French destroyed 250 tons of munitions, 1,500 weapons and several trucks, but failed to reach the major depots. And even this loss was only capital. Giap's flow of revenue from China would soon replace it. The French withdrawal took hard fighting. A major ambush by RGT 36 at Chan Muong past the 17th of November cost units of GMIS 1 and 4 BMI Tonti Ray, for a BM 7 ERTA, RICM 1953 April. Giap had kept 308, 312 and 316 divs in the Thai highlands since they had outrun their supplies the previous November. He now invaded Laos, forced to use their entire air supply fleet. The French established large fortified centers on the plain of Jars and at Luang Prabang. Having rehearsed his army in large-scale mobile warfare, Giap withdrew all but a small force, keeping his options open. June Jen, Ceylon was replaced as CNC by Jen, Navar, July Up, Hirondelle, a major drop over VM depots around Lang Sun, involved c. 2,000 Paris of 6 and 80 BPC, 2 EBP. Much material was destroyed. Despite a sharp enemy response, the Paris withdrew successfully, marching 50 miles to link up with GM5 pushing up RC, 4 from Tianyan. On the 28th of July, major forces were committed to Op. Camargue on the Annam coast. Turin Hu Quang tried to clear a stretch of RC, 1 Loru Sanshuat, of the elusive VMRGT 95, long concealed in a chain of villages surrounded by lagoons and sand dunes. 1 land and 2 amphibious task forces included 10 BNS of infantry naval commandos, Legion, North Africans, Gumiers, Senegalese, ANV, Moang and 2 of airdrop Paris to 1 RCP, 3 East BPVN, 3 amphibious groups, tanks from 1 RIC, RICM and 6 RSM, and strong artillery, air, and naval gunfire support. Most of our GT 95 managed to disperse and escape. Sept October the 3 phase up. Brochet sent 18 BNS. opening parenthesis INCL.1 or BEP, 1 or BPC, 5 East BPVN, 2 N 313 ADBLE, RICM DNA 3, 4 N12 in a major sweep against Viet 42 N50 in the Bamboo Canal sector of the northern delta. Despite some success, the VM continued to dominate perhaps 5,000 of the 7,000 villages inside the delta. November up. Moet, against 320 Div. On the southern delta defenses, occupied 7 GMIS, units Inkle. I5 Uray, I-Dien 213 ADBLE, 2-1 RCP, 80 BPC, RICM, DNA 3 and 12. Novdek Op. Castor 2-1 RCP, 1 6E and 80 BPC, 1 BEP, 5 East BPV and jumped into Dien Bien Phu Valley against light resistance the 20th to the 23rd of November. 2-1 RCP, 1 and 6 EBPC were withdrawn the 11th of December, followed by 5 East BPV in the 25th of January. 1 BEP and 80 Chalk remained while a massive airlift installed the rest of the garrison. I2 EN 3 Ray, IN 313 ADBLE, and 3 Legion mortar calls. 2 EBM 1 RTA, 3 BM 3 RTA, 5 EBM 7 RTA, 1 BM 3 RTM, 2 EN 3 BT, 20 4 by 105 mm guns of 2 EN 310 Iraq, and 4 by 155 mm of 101 for Iraq, 10 M20 for 10. Early probes into the surrounding hills met surprisingly strong resistance. The VM began desultory shelling on the 31st of December, and French movement even inside the valley was soon greatly confined. Between November 1953 and March 1954, Giap moved some 49,500 men of 304, 308, 312, 316, and 300 to the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu. They, and scores of thousands of coolies, also transported at least 200 by 75 mm and 105 mm guns plus many heavy mortars and RCLS, and perhaps 20 by 37 mm A guns. These were installed and camouflaged so skillfully that they proved almost immune to air and artillery attack. Vast quantities of ammunition and other materiel were carried in. The French were well informed of this huge operation, but were unable to halt it despite a major air effort. 1954. Jan March, a series of operations codenamed Atlanta and Annam tied down 25 BNS, 3 artillery groups, 2 armored skins, naval CDOs, and many NV units. Results were disappointing. Reserves were thereafter transferred north, leaving GM 100 and ANV units to hold the Central Highlands alone. Jan-July zigzagging back and forth to meet orchestrated threats to Pleiku, Kontum, and KN Dak Dole. GM 100 was ground down in a series of catastrophic ambushes, particularly by independent regular RGTs 803 and 108. It was finally wiped out only days before the ceasefire. The 13th of March, for the first time, Dien Bien Phu was massively bombarded, with serious losses including commanders, and great damage to inadequately protected positions. That night the northeast strongpoint Beatrice 313 ADBLE was overrun. The next night, the northern strongpoint Gabrielle 5 EBM 7 ERTA. From now on, VM artillery and AA could be brought ever closer to the airstrip and the central camp, and VM sapping could begin to strangle individual perimeter strongpoints. Piecemeal parachuting of reinforcements 5 East BPVN, 14th, 6 East BPC, 16th could not keep up with losses. The last C-47 managed to take off on the 27th of March. Thereafter all men and materiel had to be parachuted into a shrinking perimeter, under fierce AA fire. The monsoon rains began on the 29th of March. -1 massive attacks on the vital eastern hill strongpoints Ilian and Dominique. The 30th of March, the 6th of April were only partly repulsed, with great loss to both sides. The tempo of attacks varied during the month. The pattern was heavy bombardment by day, and mass assaults after dark from ever-tightening rings of approach trenches. Strong points were lost, retaken, cut off, and lost again, though they fought heroically. The effective infantry, French and Vietnamese Paris, legionnaires, and some North Africans, dwindled as casualties mounted and exhaustion worsened. Transport and tactical aircraft losses to AA became serious. Ammunition, food, drugs, and all other necessities ran desperately short. 2 1 or CP and 2 EDP parachuted in 1st, 5th, and 9th, 10th, but could only delay the inevitable. May part of 1 or BPC was parachuted 3rd, 5th. The final VM assaults broke through 6th, 7th, and on the 7th of May the camp surrendered. Apart from the most seriously wounded, the entire surviving garrison went into captivity, where most lightly wounded died within for months.